This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 422 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. The FanDuel Podcast Network Listener League is back for Week 4, and the 13-game slate is loaded with studs and value plays alike. It's going to be a fun week. So enter the rake-free weekly NFL contest made exclusively for you, the FanDuel Podcast Network listener. It's just $5, and you can compete for your share of the $1,500 prize pool, including $150 for first place. You can enter up to 3 lineups in the contest, too. To enter, visit fanduel.com/league/listener league. Eligibility restrictions apply. The first question this week is from @FFLife. It says, what should people do with Dobbins, Swift, and Akers? Now, people probably aren't going to love my answer here, but there's not much that you can actually do. You can't trade them because their values are so low right now. You can't start them because they're not getting enough run in their offense. You've got to just hold tight and hope that one of those players emerges. And for the record, I don't think dropping one of them is the right thing to do either. It's week 3, and I think each one of those running backs is talented. At the absolute least, they're very high-end handcuffs. This next question is from @K19Trust. What are your thoughts on the Rams' backfield, Henderson and Akers, going forward? I grabbed Henderson off waivers last week, and I'm wondering if he is a hold or a sell. So Henderson saw 74% of the team's running back rushes and about a 10% target share last week, and he was effective. What we saw in Henderson this past week was what I saw as a prospect, and why I was into him entering this season. He's now been a top 12 fantasy back in back-to-back weeks without Cam Akers. And I just think given the way things are trending, he has to be the favorite in that backfield moving forward, at least in this season. He's Pro Football Focus's top running back right now. But make no mistake, I'd expect Akers to have a role this year when he's healthy. They've talked about that backfield being a committee for a while now. I just wouldn't be eager to sell Henderson right now because I do think that he's a good running back. I don't think this is a fluke. This is what we were expecting from him last year. As always with the running back position, though, things can change and they can change fast. I just am favoring Darrell Henderson right now. This next question is from @ISuckAtFantasy2. Pick one of each quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end that is currently top 12 in scoring that you see finishing outside the top 12, not including injuries. So these questions are always easy to go for guys that are ranked like 11th or 12th since they're already on the fringe, but I'll try not to do that. Quarterback is kind of tough to not look at the bottom portion of the top 12, though. I think Russell Wilson, Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, Dak Prescott, Kyler Murray, I think all of them are here to stay. And Aaron Rodgers is playing really, really well. It's hard to doubt him the rest of the season. And even though Lamar Jackson is the QB12, I would imagine that he's going to be a top 12 quarterback at the end of the season. I think I'll probably go with Big Ben as the answer at quarterback, though. Only because the remaining pocket quarterbacks of these players, basically of the remaining quarterbacks who aren't Cam Newton, so Matt Ryan, Jared Goff, and Joe Burrow, Ben Roethlisberger is the one who's exceeding touchdown expectation the most when you look at how many yards he's had versus how many touchdowns he should have had based on the number of yards that he's had. That was a mouthful. I think you understand, though. Now, at running back, as tempted as I am to say Nick Chubb for the reasons that I've talked about on this show, I'll go with James Robinson because it's an easy out. It's not like Jacksonville's offense is that great. And even though his usage is awesome, he is over-exceeding based on expected fantasy points. Nick Chubb is too, but at least Chubb has a history. And it pains me to say that about my guy Robinson too. At wide receiver, I would be surprised if both Robbie Anderson and Allen Lazard finish as top 12 guys. And they're in the top 12 right now. And then at tight end, it's Jimmy Graham for me. But that position is an S show, so who knows what happens there. This last question is from @TTE720. Is it time to drop AJ Green? No, I would not be dropping AJ Green. He had a tough couple of weeks getting acclimated to things in weeks 1 and 2, and then he faced Darius Slay this past week. The fact is, he's still seeing almost 21% of Cincinnati's targets. He's second in the NFL in air yards. That's a sign that things are going to bounce back in his favor. You don't have to start him, but you won't find wide receivers with those peripheral numbers on most waiver wires. This next question is from @MarkShoe27. With Bruce Arians' comments about Keyshawn Vaughn this past week, do you think he can be a potential league winner if the running back room continues to be ambiguously mediocre? Is he worth stashing in redraft or targeting in dynasty trades? So Bruce Arians' comments this week were, quote, "Your time's coming." And that was in relation to Keyshawn Vaughn, who's gotten a slow start to his career after being on the COVID list and being a rookie. But yeah, as someone who liked Vaughn coming out, I don't think this is a bad idea at all, especially because Leonard Fournette is banged up. I'm recording this on Thursday, but at this time, Fournette hasn't practiced this week, which means there's a chance that Vaughn is active in week 4. I don't think the team's running backs have been totally atrocious this year, but I'd like to see what Vaughn could do as a pass catcher in that offense. Given the quote in the Fournette injury, I've added him in a couple of spots. If nothing comes to fruition, no big deal. This is why I like having one spot on every roster where I can just cycle through players like this each week. This next question is from @ArtClaassen. You often talk of the correlation between yards and touchdowns. Last week, you mentioned it was approximately 164 receiving yards per touchdown for wide receivers. What are the numbers for the other positions? Also, are there any strong correlations to touchdown production? So since 2011, wideouts have scored on about every 165 yards. Quarterbacks on every 163 or so. I might have said 164 the other day, so my bad. Tight ends score on every 130. Running backs score on the ground every 146. And running backs through the air on every 220. This is not the end all. This is not the end all when talking about touchdown regression. I feel like I have to say it every year, but yards to touchdowns is just a high-level way of looking at this. It's a high-level way of spotting who's over and underperforming in the touchdown column. You ask what else correlates to touchdown production, and it's what you would expect. It's things like touches at the goal line, within the opponent's 10-yard line, end zone targets, offensive situation. There are a lot of things that will help a player score a lot of touchdowns, and those are things that I try to cover on this show when I talk about regression. But hopefully this answer helps you a little bit. This next question says, when is it time to hop off the quote positive/negative regression train and just realize that's what this player is, i.e. Aaron Jones, Julio Jones, etc.? Never. The answer to this is never. But maybe I should give that statement some context. If you're saying that Aaron Jones is going to score 19 touchdowns per season because that's just who he is, then I'll give you mountains of evidence as to why that's not going to happen. If you tell me that Aaron Jones is going to score more touchdowns than the average running back in a similar situation, sure, I won't disagree with that statement. More than likely. But how far do we take it? One of the problems that I've had with people hitting Twitter this year and saying things like, Aaron Jones doesn't believe in touchdown regression, is that Aaron Jones is not in the same situation this year. Last season, he scored about 8 more touchdowns than he should have. That's based on a metric that I use, and that's based on Mike Clay's opportunity-adjusted touchdown metric as well. But last season, Jones was averaging a 57% running back rush share per game to go along with a per-game target share of about 12.5%. And he was in an offense that finished 18th in total yards. This season, Jones has seen 61% of the team's running back rushes, so a similar number but a little bit higher to last year. But his target share has risen by 5.5 percentage points. And the Packers currently have the second highest yardage total in all of football. Guys, his situation is better. And with that newly improved situation, the difference between the number of fantasy points that Jones should have scored so far versus how many he actually has scored, it's not that dramatic. It's not as dramatic as what you'll find with someone like Nick Chubb. Last year, it was dramatic because the situation was entirely different. This is why you haven't heard a peep from me about selling Aaron Jones this year. This isn't totally unsustainable in this offense. I think this is where touchdown regression conversations sort of get lost a little bit. There's this assumption of workload carryover from one season to the next. But Aaron Jones is being used differently than he was last year. And last year was when me and other analysts were saying that he was going to regress in the touchdown column. And he's been placed in a far better offensive situation this year. That's what this really comes down to. It's the same for Julio Jones too. Jones has had moments where he has underperformed touchdown-wise. And then he regresses. We've seen that multiple times throughout his career. But Jones also hasn't been someone who's seen amazing work close to the end zone. at least compared to how much overall volume that he's seen. His 2017 season was truly an outlier performance. He only scored 3 times, but he tied his career high in end zone targets. He should have scored way more than he did. But we've had seasons like that from players in the past, like Calvin Johnson. If you look at the seasons where Julio scored 6 touchdowns instead of 8, there's a direct correlation in red zone usage per game and end zone targets per game. And over his career, even with a simple yards to touchdown conversion, he averages underperforming in the touchdown column by 1.75 per season. That doesn't even factor in how he's being used. It just factors in yards, and he compiles yards better than anyone. But to go back to the original question here, instead of digging into the 2 examples that were mentioned, never bet against regression. But I do think some of this is subjective, and it depends on how people consume the true meaning of regression. Like, I think that we would all agree that Russell Wilson's not going to maintain this pace of scoring touchdowns all season long. That doesn't mean that he won't be well above average or that he can't. He's been above average in touchdown rate his entire career because he's good. And the offenses that he's been in have forced the ball down the field and they target receivers in the end zone. Those things are going to boost a player's overall touchdown numbers. So I guess what this long rant is basically saying is everything always needs context. When I'm speaking about regression on this show, I'm attempting to provide that context for you. But situations change all the time, and every situation is unique. This next question says, is it time to move on from Logan Thomas until there's a quarterback change? It's frustrating seeing the metrics, but it's not producing in fantasy. Thank you. I wouldn't drop Thomas because his peripherals are literally some of the best in football at the tight end position. And we study and analyze those secondary numbers because they're important for future performance. We can't just look at fantasy points scored. I don't think it's time to move on because we've only played 3 games. We've only seen 3 games played. Now, I also don't think that Dwayne Haskins is very good. So don't get me wrong here. I just don't know what your alternative would really be off the waiver wire. The tight end position sucks. It's awful. So I'm still holding on to Logan Thomas in spots where I don't have a weekly plug-and-play tight end. And there aren't many of those guys. This next question sort of relates to that. It's from @67 Mike Brown. Tight ends taking up roster spots. Ingram, Hawkinson, Schultz. You see any of them being an easy every week starter moving forward? I don't, at least right now. But like I just mentioned, I think that there are only maybe like 4 or 5 guys who are weekly plug-and-play starters. Hawkinson is still the tight end 9 right now in PPR formats too. I think that's another way of looking at all of this. It feels like our tight ends suck. Like the tight end on your roster feels like it's terrible, that he's not performing very well. And then we look at how they're doing in the context of the position, and they're really not that bad. I mean, Mo Alley Cox right now is a top 10 tight end, and he barely ran any routes last week. It's just a disaster of a position. And whether you keep them or not is going to depend solely on what your waiver wire looks like and who you'd be picking up for one of those players. This next question is from @hen_Diddy. What are your thoughts on Miles Sanders? Trade or keep him? The Eagles' offense is decimated, and I feel teams can just focus on him, and that will cap his ceiling. I mean, to be fair, the Eagles' offense was decimated last year too, and Miles Sanders was great down the stretch. I don't think selling him right now is a great idea because the market doesn't seem to realize how tough it is to find his market share numbers. In 2 games, Sanders has averaged about 17.5% of the team's targets per game and 79% of the team's running back rushes. I mean, he's a bell cow. The upcoming schedule is going to be tough, but I'd ride it out given those peripherals. The last question this week is from @SlinkyPudding. Sorry if I missed it in the offseason, but was there any process to the idea that Seattle would, quote, let Russ cook this season? Was the only difference between past seasons that they now have DK Metcalf? I thought for sure they'd just repeat the same run-heavy script as usual. So Seahawks fans have been talking about letting Russ cook for some time now. It was a movement. It is a movement. Because anyone who's watched the Seahawks in recent history, they've tilted their faces off watching one of the best quarterbacks in the league handing off the ball to his running backs, and then having to come back in the fourth quarter because of that week over week. Now, in terms of it being foreseeable, I don't think it was just totally predictable, but I talked about this a lot on this podcast in the offseason. A conservative run-first offense was sort of being embedded into Seattle players' ADPs. Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf specifically. They were both being drafted as if the Seahawks were absolutely going to be the same old Seahawks. But there was always the possibility that with Metcalf another year in, and with the way the season went last year, that they would just turn things up a bit. And if that happened, which is what we're seeing now, then players like Metcalf and Lockett would end up as huge bargains. When we're drafting, and look, I tried to stress this as much as possible in the offseason, so this is not me just being an obnoxious hindsight analyst. But when we're drafting in fantasy football, we should look at whether or not there's obvious room for growth with a player's projection and a player's ADP. Sometimes it works out, like DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett. Sometimes it doesn't, like Derrick Henry. Like Derrick Henry had a chance. There was at least a chance that he'd see a higher target share this year because there wasn't that much backfield competition. And he's seen a slight uptick in target share, but it just hasn't been all that meaningful yet. But he was being drafted as the guy who was not going to be that player. He was being drafted as a player who wasn't going to see a lot of receptions. So even if we didn't see that higher range hit, we at least knew that we would get something from Derrick Henry. And that's what made him a pretty decent mid-first round pick, is that there was at least some room for growth there. That's similar to what went down with the Seahawks. Even if they didn't let Russ cook this year, we still would have gotten usable fantasy assets at their ADP. It just so happens that so far, they're letting Russ cook. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter. I tweet a lot, at Late Round QB. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate you all listening all week. I will talk to you next week. Enjoy your weekend.